The sky was turning the color of bruised steel when she stumbled onto the mountain trail, one arm wrapped around her stomach, the other dragging the ragged hem of her dress through frozen mud that clung to her shoes like chains. The world had already decided she would not survive. She could see it in the way the wagon that left her behind never slowed, in the way its wheels carved clean lines through the snow and vanished around the bend without even a backward glance. 14 years old, a child carrying another, she followed those fading tracks until the wind stole their shape, and her breath turned to smoke. Each step rattled inside her chest, her fingers stiff and blue, her heart thudding a rhythm between panic and surrender. The forest pressed close on both sides, black pines whispering in the half-light, the smell of resin and storm thick in the air. When her knees buckled, she caught herself on a rock and stared into the whiteness that stretched ahead, a wilderness too wide for anyone to notice her vanishing. Then she saw him. A figure on horseback halfway up the ridge, unmoving against the snow, coat long and dark, shoulders broad enough to make the world look small. For a heartbeat, she thought he was a mirage born of exhaustion, another shadow meant to mock her hope. But the horse shifted, snorted, and she heard the low creak of leather. The man dismounted with slow precision, his boots breaking the crust of ice as he came nearer, not close enough to touch, just close enough for his voice to reach her through the wind. "You're hurt," he said, the words steady and careful, shaped by a calm that didn't belong in such a cruel place. She tried to answer, but her lips wouldn't move. Only a thin gasp escaped, a sound between apology and surrender. He dropped his saddlebag, opened it, and pulled out a folded blanket the color of rusted earth. He didn't step forward. He laid it on the ground between them. A line of warmth offered, not imposed. Then he struck flint against steel, the spark catching in dry moss until a small flame wavered to life. The smell of smoke rose like a prayer. She hesitated, then crawled toward it, her hands shaking so badly that the fire's light quivered on her skin. He turned away, giving her the dignity of not being watched as she tried to gather herself. Up close, the man looked carved from the same weather that punished these mountains, face lined by wind, hair streaked with ash gray, eyes that had learned how to hold pain without letting it spill. His horse stamped and lowered its head, as if impatient to move on. But he didn't. "There's a cabin down the ridge," he said finally. "You'll freeze if you stay out here." She flinched at the word freeze, because she'd been hearing it whispered all day, by the wind, by her fear, by the memory of voices that had told her she wasn't worth saving. Still she nodded. When she tried to stand, her legs failed, and before she could fall, his arm was suddenly there, strong, steady, catching her weight without claiming it. For a moment she leaned into him, just enough to feel the steady rise and fall of another human breath. He guided her toward the horse, lifted her carefully onto the saddle, then walked beside her as they started down the trail, snow thickening around their boots. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he meant to help or if mercy was just a word she'd dreamed. But as the last trace of wagon wheels disappeared beneath the falling white, she realized she was no longer moving toward death. For the first time in days, she was simply being carried somewhere warm. The ride down the ridge felt longer than the whole road she had walked alone. Every jolt of the horse sent pain through her ribs and a strange ache through her chest. Not from fear this time, but from something she didn't yet know how to name. The man walked beside her, his hand steady on the reins, the snow rising around them like white smoke. He said nothing, not even when her head began to droop or when her fingers slipped from the edge of the blanket he'd wrapped around her. The wind eased once they reached the valley, trading its scream for a low hum that moved through the trees. Then she saw the cabin, half hidden behind a cluster of spruce, its roof bowed under the weight of snow. The smoke curling from the chimney was the first living thing she'd seen in days. When he pushed the door open, the warmth struck her like light after blindness. He helped her down but didn't touch her skin, just guided her toward the hearth where a small fire glowed. "Sit," he said quietly, and she did, too tired to argue. The cabin smelled of pine and saddle oil, and faintly of bread, though there was none in sight. He poured water into a pot, added what looked like dried beans and a strip of meat, and set it on the coals. "You from town?" he asked after a while. She shook her head. "Didn't think so." His tone carried no judgment, only recognition. Her gaze drifted to the shelves along the wall, tools lined with care, a folded blanket, a Bible with its cover worn to softness. Everything about the place spoke of someone who had been alone too long but never let the loneliness rot. When she finally whispered, "Why'd you stop?" He looked up, brow furrowed, as if surprised by the question. Seemed wrong not to. The words hung there, simple and enormous. She hadn't known wrong and right could still look like this, quiet, human, without sermon or spectacle. He ladled her a bowl of stew once it was ready, placed it on the floor beside her, and stepped back. She ate slowly, afraid it might disappear if she hurried. Outside, the storm was settling into a hush. For a long time, neither spoke. When she started to drift toward sleep, he took his coat and laid it over her shoulders. "You can rest," he said, his voice low, almost tender. "I'll keep the fire going." She opened her mouth to thank him, but words wouldn't come. Gratitude had grown foreign in her mouth. He nodded once, as though he'd heard it anyway, and went to sit near the door. The flames flickered against the walls, painting his face in soft amber. She watched him through half-closed eyes, realizing that for the first time in her life, a man's silence didn't mean danger. It meant peace. And before sleep took her, she thought that maybe the mountains weren't trying to kill her after all. Maybe they'd just been waiting for someone to bring her in from the cold. She woke to the smell of coffee and the low crackle of fire. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The warmth, the stillness, the sound of someone breathing just a few feet away. When her eyes opened fully, she saw him sitting by the window, one hand wrapped around a tin mug, watching the light creep through the frost on the glass. He didn't look at her right away, and she was grateful. The cabin felt different in daylight, safer, but also too clear. There was nowhere to hide what she carried, the curve of her stomach faint under her dress. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket closer, expecting the question she'd been asked too many times. "Who's the father? What did you do?" But it never came. He only said, "You sleep all right?" and turned back to the window. His voice was steady. No pity, no suspicion, just simple concern. "Yes," she whispered. It sounded strange, that word, like a language she hadn't spoken in years. He nodded, poured another mug, and set it near her on the table. "Ain't much, but it'll keep you warm." The coffee was bitter and black, but it burned its way through the cold inside her. She watched him as he mended a leather strap, his movements unhurried, his eyes calm. When she finally spoke again, her voice shook. "You're not gonna ask?" He looked up then, eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Ask what?" "My name, where I'm from. Why I'm like this." She gestured weakly to her stomach, shame flushing her face. He leaned back in the chair, rubbed his jaw, and shook his head. "If you wanted me to know, you'd tell me." The words stopped her cold, not from cruelty, but from the simple mercy of not being forced to explain. No one had ever let her keep her silence before. He went back to his work, the quiet between them thick but not heavy. Outside, the storm had broken, leaving sunlight trembling on the snow like spilled glass. She stared at it through the window, and for the first time in months, the world didn't look like something trying to bury her. He finished his repair, hung the strap by the door, and said, "Name's Cole." She hesitated, then said softly, "Mara." He nodded once. "You can rest as long as you need, Mara. No one comes up here except me and the wind." She managed a small, uncertain smile. It was the first time she'd heard her name spoken without judgment. As the fire popped behind them, she realized the truth of what mercy sounded like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't soft. It was a man who asked nothing at all. By the third morning, she had started to move around the cabin, sweeping the floor, folding the blanket, pretending she wasn't afraid of belonging somewhere. Cole didn't stop her, didn't hover. He just worked outside, chopping wood, mending fences, his rhythm unbroken by her presence. Yet every sound he made reminded her of the men she'd known before. Their boots, their tempers, their words that promised help but meant harm. Even his kindness made her flinch sometimes. When he brought in water from the creek, she'd shrink back without meaning to, and he'd pause, step aside, and set the bucket down quietly, as though he could hear her heart pounding louder than the wind. That evening, when the sun melted behind the ridge, she caught him staring into the fire with a look she couldn't read. Part sorrow, part memory. "You lost someone?" she asked, then regretted it instantly. His gaze flicked toward her, then back to the flames. "A wife," he said simply. "Long time ago?" The words carried no bitterness, just a kind of worn truth. "I was gone when she needed me most." Mara looked down, unsure what to say. "You blame yourself?" she whispered. "Every man does, one way or another," he replied, then smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. She wanted to ask more, but didn't. The silence stretched until the fire popped, and she jumped at the sound. He noticed, and his voice gentled. "You don't have to be scared here. I know what fear smells like. It's no good for either of us." She looked up then, really looked, and saw that his face wasn't as hard as she thought. He was younger than his stillness made him seem. "It's hard not to be," she said, voice trembling. "People always want something back when they help." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the fire throwing orange light over his hands. "Then they ain't helping. They're just trading pain for power." She let the words settle, feeling them crack something open inside her. For the rest of the night, she couldn't stop hearing them. Outside, the storm had passed, but the cold still pressed against the walls, testing the seams. When she finally lay down, she watched him from the cot. The way his shoulders slumped as he sat by the fire, head bowed in quiet prayer he didn't speak aloud. He wasn't like the men she'd known. He didn't touch, didn't demand, didn't look at her like she owed him for his mercy. And somehow, that scared her even more. Because if he didn't want anything, she didn't know how to live in a world like that. The thaw came early that year, loosening the snow from the ridge and filling the creek until it ran wild and loud again. Mara had begun to walk outside, her strength returning, the color creeping back into her face. Cole kept his distance but always worked nearby, mending the fence, hauling wood, pretending not to watch her steady herself against the post when her knees trembled. It might have stayed that way. Simple, quiet, healing, if not for the men from town. They arrived near dusk, 3 of them on horseback, their laughter echoing before they came into view. Mara heard the sound and froze where she stood, the water bucket still in her hands. Cole stepped out from the barn, his expression unreadable. "Evening. one of the riders called, a tall man with a thin mustache and a scar along his jaw. "Heard you got company up here. Thought we'd see for ourselves." Cole's face didn't change. "Ain't much to see," he said. "You've seen it. Now ride home." The men chuckled, glancing past him toward the cabin where Mara had gone still as a stone. "Didn't know you were running a shelter for strays," another man sneered. "Town's been talking. Girl like that, young, with a belly, don't belong with a man like you." Cole stepped closer, his boots sinking deep into the thawing mud. "You best stop talking." The air seemed to freeze between them. The first man's smirk faltered when he caught the calm in Cole's eyes, the kind that didn't shout, didn't threaten, but promised something final if pushed. "We're just saying," he muttered, pulling on his reins. "Folks don't take kindly to secrets in these parts." Cole didn't answer. He stood there until the sound of hooves faded down the trail, until the wind swallowed their voices. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin. Mara stood in the doorway, trembling, one hand pressed to her stomach. "They know," she whispered. He shook his head. "Let 'em know. You didn't do anything wrong." She looked at him, eyes wide and wet. That's never stopped them before. He didn't argue, just moved past her and stoked the fire higher, the glow filling the room until the shadows fled to the corners. "This place'll hold," he said quietly. "Storms come and go, Mara. Let 'em talk themselves empty." She sank to her knees beside the hearth, tears falling without sound. For the first time, she didn't hide them. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak again. He just stayed in the same room while she cried, his presence steady as the fire's hum. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the laughter of the men far away into the dark. The next morning, the world felt heavier, as if the men's words had settled on the mountain overnight. Mara moved quietly around the cabin, her every motion careful, guilt pressing like a stone in her chest. She wanted to thank him, to say something that would undo the trouble she had brought to his door, but she couldn't find the right shape for the words. Cole, for his part, said little. He worked through the day as he always did, splitting wood, checking the traps, tending the mare that had started limping in the snow, but something in his stillness had changed. It wasn't anger, not even disappointment. It was caution, the kind of silence men carry when they're trying to protect more than just themselves. When he finally came back inside, dusk had fallen, and she had supper waiting on the table. He looked at the food, then at her. His eyes kind but tired. "You don't owe me this," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but I need to do something. I've done enough damage just by being here." His brow furrowed, and he set down his gloves. "You didn't bring that talk here. Folks did. Let them rot in their noise." She wanted to believe him, but shame lived deeper than reason. She turned away, blinking fast, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what they said when they left me, what I did to survive." He stood there a long moment before answering. "Don't need to. You're here now, that's enough." The gentleness in his tone nearly broke her. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice sharp from fear more than defiance. "You don't even know me." He took a breath, the kind that comes from far down in the chest. "Because somebody should have cared before now." The room went still. She gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling apart. No one had ever said that to her. Not the preacher, not the midwife, not the people who'd turned their eyes when she passed. He didn't ask forgiveness, didn't preach salvation. He just stood there, letting the truth of his words settle between them. Finally, she sank into the chair, her hands trembling. "I don't know how to be grateful," she said. He gave a small, weary smile. Then just breathe. That's enough for tonight. Outside, the snow had melted into rain, and the roof began to sing with it, soft and steady. Cole moved to stoke the fire, the orange light flaring up again, and for a moment she thought maybe mercy wasn't something you deserved. It was something that found you anyway. No matter how much you tried to hide, the storm returned that night without warning, a wild, shrieking wind that clawed at the cabin walls as if trying to drag them both back into the dark they'd escaped. Mara woke gasping, a sharp pain cutting through her ribs. The air inside felt thick, heavy, and wrong. For a heartbeat, she thought it was another nightmare. Then the cramps came. She doubled over, gripping her stomach, sweat cold on her temples. The fire had burned low, throwing shadows instead of light. Cole stirred from the chair by the door, already rising before she could speak. "Mara," he said, the word quiet but full of alarm. She couldn't answer, only shook her head as tears spilled down her cheeks. He knelt beside her, his rough hand hovering just close enough to steady her without touching. "Breathe slow, you hear me? You're not alone." She tried, but the pain kept breaking the rhythm, her body fighting itself. He crossed to the table, poured water, and pressed the cup into her hands. "Drink. You have to keep steady." His voice had changed, lower, firmer, the kind used by men who've seen storms worse than weather. She obeyed, trembling, swallowing between gasps. Outside, the wind roared louder, rattling the door on its hinges. "It's coming early," she whispered, her voice barely there. "The baby, it's too soon." Cole froze, then shook his head once. "Then we keep it alive as long as we can. Both of you." He fed the fire, added wood until the cabin glowed, then tore a strip from his undershirt and soaked it in water. She watched him move. No panic, no disgust, no hesitation, just a kind of grim mercy. "You ain't got to do this," she sobbed between breaths. "You don't owe me." "I know," he said, cutting her off softly. "That's why I'm staying." The words hit her harder than the pain. For hours, he stayed by her side, feeding the fire, cooling her forehead, whispering when she drifted toward the edge of consciousness. At some point, she lost track of time. There was only his voice, the storm, and the fight inside her own body. When at last she slept, the wind had died, leaving only the hiss of rain on the roof. Cole sat motionless by the fire, eyes fixed on the embers, his hands stained with the marks of struggle and care. He looked at her, pale but breathing steady now, and something in his chest eased. The storm outside had passed, but the one inside him, the guilt, the memory of a wife he hadn't saved, quieted for the first time in years. As dawn crept through the cracks in the walls, he whispered a few words that never reached her ears. "You're safe now. You both are." When she woke, the storm had gone, leaving the world washed and quiet. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls, soft as breath, turning the air gold. For a long time, she didn't move, afraid that the peace she felt was only another dream she'd lose by blinking. Then the sound of boots shifting on wood broke the stillness. Cole sat by the stove, half asleep, his shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed red from a night without rest. The sight of him, this man who had faced her pain without flinching, brought tears she couldn't stop. He looked up, startled when he saw her awake. "You're all right," he said, voice raw from whispering through the night. She nodded, though her throat ached. "It stopped," she murmured. He followed her gaze to the bundle near the hearth, small, still, wrapped in a piece of linen. There was no movement beneath it. His jaw tightened. "It wasn't your fault," he said, before she could speak. But she shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Everything's been my fault since I can remember." He rose slowly, walked to the window, and opened it just enough for the morning air to come in. "World's good at lying like that," he said. "Makes folks believe they earned every hurt they've been given." The words settled deep inside her, where guilt had built its nest. She looked at him, really looked, and realized his mercy wasn't the easy kind. It came from something broken, too. "You lost someone once," she whispered. "You said that before." He nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "My wife. Our child with her." She waited for him to say more, but he didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent. He turned back, kneeling beside her. "You want to bury her?" he asked softly. She bit her lip, unable to speak, then nodded. Together they carried the small bundle outside, where the ground was soft from thaw. Cole dug while she stood by, clutching her shawl against the wind. When it was done, he bowed his head, saying nothing, and she found herself whispering a prayer she hadn't remembered in years. The world felt vast and still. For the first time, her grief didn't echo back hollow. It found a place to rest. When they went back inside, she stopped by the door. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He looked at her a long moment before answering. "Because I couldn't help the last ones," he said quietly, "and because no one should bury anything alone." She closed her eyes, pressing her hands against her heart. There were no more tears left. Only the strange, heavy calm of someone forgiven before she'd asked. The fire crackled, the sunlight warmed the floor, and she knew, whatever tomorrow brought, she would not run again. Mercy had found her, and she had decided to stay. The snow was gone by the time the lilacs bloomed along the creek, their pale scent riding the wind that swept down from the mountains. Spring had unfolded slow and deliberate, the way healing does when no one rushes it. Mara spent her mornings by the water, washing linens, hanging them to dry between two pines that leaned like old friends. The cabin no longer felt borrowed. Her things, what little she had found quiet corners to belong in. Cole worked the small patch of earth near the barn, turning soil with patience rather than urgency. He didn't talk much about that winter, and she didn't ask. Some things didn't need retelling to be remembered. What had begun as shelter had become a life that neither of them had planned. She cooked, mended, gathered herbs. He worked the fences, hunted, and built her a rocking chair from spare wood. It creaked softly at night, and she called it the chair that forgives, though he only smiled when she said it. Once, as they shared coffee on the porch, she caught him watching the valley with that same quiet ache he wore when he thought no one noticed. "You ever go back?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "To town sometimes," he said finally, "but not to her grave. Not yet." She nodded, understanding. "Some things you don't go back to," she said softly. "You let the ground remember for you." The wind moved her hair, and he looked at her then, not with pity but recognition. There was a peace in her face that hadn't been there before. She'd filled out again, her eyes steady, her hands strong. He realized the mountain had given him back something he hadn't dared hope for. Not love, exactly, but the proof that mercy could still change a life even when it came too late to save the past. As the sun sank behind the ridge, gold spilling across the grass, he spoke low, almost to himself. "You'll go someday," he said. "Find your place. You should." She shook her head, smiling faintly. "I already did." For a long moment they sat in silence, the air between them alive with everything they didn't need to say. When night came, she lit the lamp, its glow spilling across the table where 2 plates now sat instead of 1. The world outside kept on turning, but in that cabin, time had softened into something sacred. 2 lost souls learning that survival and peace could share the same breath. By summer, the valley had turned green again, and the river below the ridge ran fast with melted snow. Cole hitched his horse one morning, saddlebags packed, a map folded neat inside his coat. He'd told her the night before that he meant to ride east, to settle a debt, maybe find what was left of the world he'd turned from. She said little then, only nodded, but the thought had followed her through the night like a restless ghost. Now, standing in the doorway, she watched him tighten the cinch, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "You'll be all right here?" he asked. She smiled faintly, though her heart trembled. "Been all right since the day you stopped on that trail." He nodded, eyes flicking toward the hills as if searching for the courage to go. "There's a part of a man that never stops looking for what he lost," he said softly. "Maybe this time I'll find peace instead." She stepped closer, her hand brushing the worn leather of his sleeve. "You already did," she whispered. The words startled him. Simple, true, and enough to still whatever ache had driven him. He looked at her then, the girl he'd found half dead in the snow months ago, now standing tall in the sunlight, eyes clear, her strength quiet but sure. "If the road calls, you should answer it," she said gently. "But don't mistake the leaving for what saved you." For a long time, neither moved. The only sound was the wind in the grass and the low hum of the river below. Then, slowly, Cole took the reins, stared at the horizon, and let them fall from his hand. "Maybe I'll ride tomorrow," he said. She smiled. "Maybe you won't." He gave a small laugh, rare, honest, and stepped back towards the porch. The horse shifted behind him, waiting for a command that never came. He sat on the steps instead, setting his hat beside him, eyes on the sun climbing over the ridge. Mara joined him there, neither touching nor speaking, just sharing the quiet. The world stretched wide and forgiving before them, the kind of land that didn't demand anything except that you keep breathing. For the first time, Cole didn't feel haunted by what he couldn't save. He felt grateful for what had chosen to live. The road could wait. Beside him, Mara closed her eyes, her hand resting lightly over the place where loss had once ruled her body, and where now only peace remained. The mountain wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and firewood, and for a long, golden moment, it felt like the whole world was exhaling. Mercy, it seemed, had finally found its home. Sometimes salvation doesn't ride away. It stays, sits on the porch, and learns to breathe again.